Good evening. If everybody could take a seat, that would be great. All right. Well, first, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, particularly the members of the Resilient Community Roundtable and leaders from throughout Eastern Racine County. A lot of work, for sure, has happened to get to this point. But let me assure you, tonight is not the end, it's the beginning. We all represent different municipalities, all of us sitting in here, whether we're elected officials or where we live. And we may have different perspectives, maybe even differences, but I think those differences actually are an asset, not a weakness. Having worked with most of you in this room in some capacity or another, I can tell you the past 2 years, one thing I can tell you from the past 2 years is we all want a better region. A region to be a destination, not a place for people just to drive through or to get to somewhere else. A place where people want to live and work and raise a family. A place where businesses can thrive and expand. A place where the quality of life is always continuously getting better. That is what brought the Resilient Communities Roundtables members together. And it's what keeps us there, bettering our community and strengthening it all for our residents. As elected officials in this room, we want to do what residents elected us to do. We need to look forward and ensure our commitment to our fiscal and social responsibilities. Sometimes those are going to be tough decisions to be made that require bold solutions and, yes, the political will of all of us. So, with that, I would like to introduce our elected Resilient Community Roundtable members. So, if you wouldn't mind, please stand as I call your name. Mayor Corey Mason. Maybe I should have told you to hold your applause to the end. No, I'm just kidding. Caledonia President Jim Dobbs. Mount Pleasant President Dave DeGroot. Sturtevant President Jamie Hoffman. And I would be remiss if I didn't also introduce our County Board Chairman, Rusty Clark. And I also would like just to take a moment to introduce our administrators, which we all know are key figures in moving our initiatives and our vision forward. Jim Palaniuk of the City of Racine. Tom Christensen of Caledonia. Maureen Murphy of Mount Pleasant. And kind of in a special category, Jason Ekman of Sturtevant. Please stand, Jason. For the past few years, we have taken part in this Resilient Community Roundtable discussions as elected leaders of Racine County and municipalities east of I-94. Our discussions have focused on how we can work together more closely in ways that would be beneficial to each municipality and the region as a whole. The more we've talked about it, how we might help create that future, really the more questions we had. As a first step, we asked the Wisconsin Policy Forum for a fact-based, unbiased answers to some of our questions. This resulted in ongoing fiscal analysis of the county and municipalities, as well as a detailed study of parks and recreation and our fire and EMS services across the region, and possible options for future consideration on both issues. Myself and the city and village administrators have overseen the Policies Forum work with the input and involvement of several of the service departments in the respective municipalities. Now that the Policies Forum initial analyses are completed, it's time to share them with you and others across the region to continue our dialogue, to continue our communication on how we might move forward in the future. But before we begin, I wouldn't be remiss if I just didn't thank the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread for their work in bringing us together through the Resilient Communities Initiative. And yes, thank you, John. And of course, I'd like to thank the Racine Theater Guild for hosting all of us tonight. We're honored to gather at such a beautiful venue as we begin our next steps forward becoming resilient communities. So with that, thank you for being here. And with the other heads of government, I will officially call this meeting to order. And I would like to introduce Racine County Clerk Wendy Christensen to do the roll and other housekeeping issues as assigned.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm just going to give a brief review of the agenda we're going to follow this evening. Momentarily, I'm going to ask you to join me in the pledge. That'll be followed by a roll call where I ask our chief elected officers in each governmental body to let me know who of your members are here this evening. Then there's going to be a presentation that we're all here for by Mr. Rob Henkin of the Wisconsin Policy Forum. Following that, there will be an opportunity for the elected leaders here tonight to be able to ask some questions and to make sure that we keep on track and end on time. We won't be taking questions from any other members of the audience at this time tonight. After the presentation and the question and answer session, there will be some closing remarks by the Resilient Communities Roundtable members from each community, and we will adjourn promptly at 7. So now if I can ask you to all rise and say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. County Board Chairman Clark, are your members present this evening?
Yes, they are. Supervisor Trottier and Wish have asked to be excused.
Thank you. Mayor Mason, are your council members here this evening?
Yes, they are. Alders Tate, Taft, Glenn, Weiser, Lemke, Miedema, and Horton have asked to be excused.
Okay, thank you. I may ask you to run through that one more time a little bit later. Village President Dobbs from Caledonia, are your members present?
All 7 Caledonia Village Board members are here.
Thank you. Village President DeGroot from Mount Pleasant?
All Village Board members are present and accounted for, including Sunny.
Okay, thank you. And Village President Jamie Hoffman, are your members here as well?
Everyone's here except for Trustee Rosenbaum.
Thank you very much. And with that, I will now turn this back over to our County Executive Delagrave to introduce Mr. Henkin.
Well, I'm really pleased to introduce our featured speaker for this evening, Rob Henkin, President of the Wisconsin Policy Forum. Rob, as most of us know, has extensive experience in helping local governments become more efficient and functional to the highest degree possible. Rob has led the Public Policy Forum and now the Wisconsin Policy Forum since 2008. Rob was recently honored as the 2019 Person of the Year by the Milwaukee Rotary Club and has been previously named one of Milwaukee's 100 most influential leaders in the Milwaukee Business Journal. So with that, Rob, we really greatly appreciate you being here and the Policies Forum's independent, nonpartisan analysis on these important topics. Please welcome and join Rob.
Thank you, County Executive Delagrave. Thanks to everyone in the audience. Thanks to the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be with you this evening. My job is to give you a pretty high-level summary of 2 comprehensive reports that we have prepared. This was a partnership between the Wisconsin Policy Forum and the Center for Governmental Research located in Rochester, New York. Similar to the Wisconsin Policy Forum, a nonpartisan, nonprofit policy research organization whose mission is to try to promote more fact-based, data-driven decision-making in local governments and school districts. So Paul Bishop from Center for Governmental Research is also here with me this evening and will come up when we get to the Q&A portion of the session. So again, I'm going to run through the highlights of 2 reports. Both of these reports are going to be available on the Wisconsin Policy Forum website at 7 o'clock this evening. So anyone and everyone can read the full reports, and we hope that you will. Again, my job this evening is just to go through the highlights. Before I do that, it's also important for me to provide you with some background, because this is really, as the county executive said, this is a process that has been going on now for about 2.5 years. I can say to you, as one who has been involved in policy research and analysis, as one who worked for Milwaukee County government for 10 years, as one who worked for the U.S. Congress for 7 years, this is truly, and I'm not just saying this to be gratuitous, but this is truly one of the best experiences I have had in terms of a group of elected officials being willing to get together and roll up their sleeves and really talk about how to make government work better in a region. So the starting point for me, you may recognize this guy on the screen. I think I may be wearing the same suit. I'm not sure. I hope not. No, I have a lot of great suits. But it was 2 years ago this past summer, so the summer of 2017, that there was a gathering at Wingspread to go over really one of the first pieces of work that we did in association with this initiative was to look at some of the socioeconomic and fiscal indicators for the communities in the greater Racine region. So one of the things we wanted to do was sort of establish where are these communities in terms of their fiscal and socioeconomic and governmental health, not only sort of in a vacuum, but compared to one another. So we took a look at a variety of indicators, and you may have seen the newspaper coverage of this in the Journal Times this morning. Looked at a variety of different indicators that would just sort of give us some insight into where the communities were doing well, where they were doing not so well, where there may be some opportunities to work together. So that was an important part of it. And for comparative purposes, it was also important to look at the greater Racine region and compare this region to the greater Kenosha region. So I'm not going to go through much of this information, but just a few, just by way of background, that sort of set the stage for the work that followed in terms of trying to identify ways that by all working together, there could be an opportunity to see everybody rise. Some of the trends that we looked at. This is comparing the city of Racine's population to the combined population of the other east of I-94 Greater Racine communities. Included in here is a projection by Sewer PAC out to 2035. And what we see is a slight decrease in the population of the city of Racine, an increase in the surrounding communities, and per this projection, what we are seeing is that potentially by the year 2035, the combined population of the surrounding communities will be pretty darn close to the population of the city of Racine. Now, what does that mean? Sort of an eye of the beholder. But clearly, there's something in this for everyone, that this region now is, certainly Racine is the major population center, but clearly we are also seeing that where growth is occurring and is projected to occur in the future is in the surrounding community. So that says something about potentially wanting to and needing to act together on governmental services. When we look at income and earnings, again, I'm sure this is no surprise to anybody in this room, but clearly we see the city of Racine more challenged in terms of indicators like household income, per capita income, median earnings per worker. The green, by the way, we just updated these numbers recently from when we first prepared them in 2017. So if the number is in green, it means it has actually gotten better in the last 2 years. If it's in red, it has gone the other way. But again, the numbers really have not changed a great deal. But again, the picture painted of the large city in the region struggling in many different ways in terms of indicators that speak to poverty, and the surrounding communities not having issues as serious in that regard. When we look at property value trends, and here we are comparing Racine to Kenosha, and this is county-wide, again, sort of a theme emerges here. Clearly, we are starting to see recovery, not only in Racine County, but in greater Racine and in the city of Racine in terms of property value trends. But we have a county to the south that is growing much faster. We looked at other indicators, job growth, et cetera. This is just one. But just again, property value trends, we see the much more rapid growth. And that's just something to be aware of for this region as it thinks about the need to compete for businesses and residents and so forth going forward, is that we do have this higher level of growth in the county to the south. Finally, this is a very important slide. So again, we looked at economic indicators, we looked at socioeconomic indicators, we looked at indicators having to do with crime rates and various public health indicators. They all sort of paint a broad picture of a variety of different things. Where we, the Wisconsin Policy Forum, tend to hone in is, what do these indicators mean in terms of the demands that are faced by the governmental units, both the expectations and the service demands of the constituents. And I think when we have one community that has higher levels of poverty, that has a younger population, a more transient population, as compared to a set of surrounding communities who have just greater wealth and greater income, that we tend to expect that there would be a higher demand for a variety of different municipal services in the larger urban community that has the higher level of poverty. And that can often be reflected in the property tax rate. So here you are seeing the gross tax rates as of 2018 per the Wisconsin Department of Revenue for the city of Racine versus each of the surrounding communities in Greater Racine. And you can see a large gap there. And very candidly, that's a larger gap than we are accustomed to seeing. And we could probably spend the next 45 minutes talking about this gap, but we're not going to. But I think one of the things that it clearly suggests is that it is in everybody's interest in the community as a whole, trying to see itself as a region, to in an ideal world, see that gap close. Because the very factors that create the demand for services and that in many ways lead to the higher property tax rates in the city of Racine will best be resolved by seeing economic growth in the city of Racine. Yet it is difficult to achieve that economic growth if there's this type of a disparity, which results in an economic competitive disadvantage. So again, just something to be aware of without preaching to you at this point about potential solutions. So that's some background for you. The Resilient Communities Roundtable digested this information, talked a lot about different strategies and ways to move forward, again, with the primary purpose of how can these individual communities maintain their individuality, but also work together and see themselves as a region that is really dependent upon one another in terms of economic growth, in terms of being able to compete to the region to the south and other regions throughout the state of Wisconsin and the state of Illinois, for that matter. And service sharing was one of the issues that was identified as a way that potentially could address some of these disparities we were talking about, and that could just make the region function more cohesively and more effectively and more efficiently. And so we were charged to look at service sharing and where there may be some opportunities. One of the very important things that the Wisconsin Policy Forum emphasizes, and we have done service sharing studies on a variety of different types of governmental functions for local governments across the state of Wisconsin. And so I don't know if there's a more important paragraph that I'm going to put on the screen tonight than this one. Lots of times when we think about service sharing, when we think about the prospect of consolidating government services, everybody wants to turn to dollars. Well, if there's an opportunity perhaps to save money, then we'll look at it. If there's not an opportunity to save money, why would we consider it? We emphasize that clearly dollars and cents are paramount here, but really the promise in service sharing lies not necessarily in saving money, but in being able to have individual governments join together to create a higher level of service for a broader regional population than they could achieve by providing these services on their own. So again, I urge you to keep that in mind as we discuss the analyses of the specific functions of fire and EMS and Parks and Rec as we go forward this evening. That said, and one of the first things that we were asked to do was look at national research. You know, what do we know about how service sharing works and where it's been successful in the state of Wisconsin and in other parts of the country? And clearly, there's a caution here. Service sharing only may make sense under the right conditions. So one of the things that we really try to do before even going down this path of doing detailed analyses into specific governmental functions and the potential for reaping benefits from service sharing is really trying to see if the sort of the basic elements exist that may suggest that further analysis is indeed merited. And so that's what we did. One of the first studies that we came out with during the whole Resilient Communities Roundtable process after the indicators was this study called Building Bridges. It was released in September of 2018. This too available on the website, wispolicyforum.org. And we sort of did a broad scan of the variety of municipal functions that are performed by municipal governments in the greater Racine region. And what we did was for each one of these functions, we considered 6 different criteria that we used to help determine whether further deeper analysis was merited. So first is the demand for new technology or equipment or new state and federal regulations causing costs to become unaffordable. This is often a situation where, let me use public safety dispatch as an example. Now, that's a great example where the communities in Racine County have gotten together, of course, on a consolidated dispatch. There are many other parts of the state where that's not the case. But dispatch is a perfect example because there are often demands for expensive new technology to keep up with advances in cellular technology, et cetera. There often can be state or federal regulations, such as needing to move to next generation 911, that cost a lot of money. And so for little individual communities who run their own dispatch centers to consider making these investments on their own may not make a lot of sense. Maybe that's an opportunity to really want to look at whether they should get together. And this can be the case for other municipal functions as well. Another factor we look at, are there organizational changes taking place that may merit some reconsideration about whether individual communities need to provide certain services themselves or whether they may want to join together with their neighbors. So if there are 2 communities that are running departments of any function and they both know that the heads of the department are going to be retiring, that just may be an impetus to want to look at service sharing or consolidation. Can you really pinpoint from a very high level that there are clear areas of cost and efficiency or redundancies among neighboring municipalities? That's sort of one where you know it when you see it, and we're going to get into that a little bit later, but that's something we look at. Could service sharing improve the level, type, or mix of services? So again, this is not just about saving money, it's about, gee, if 2 governments or more governments got together and tried to provide a set of services together, do we think that there is potential for noticeable improvement? Do we have a situation where a single municipality may be providing a service that the larger region is benefiting from, but it really isn't helping to pay for? And so that is a consideration that may lead to discussion about, well, should we do this a different way to try to address that inequity? And finally, irrespective of new technology, it tends to be that in those governmental functions, such as fire and EMS, where capital replacement needs are expensive, a ladder truck can be $1 million, those are the areas where if you are looking at cost, oftentimes there is the greatest potential for a sharing or consolidation arrangement to actually yield substantial monetary savings. So we applied these 6 criteria, so each to roughly 10 different areas of municipal government across the region. And end of the day, we gave thumbs up and thumbs down for each of the factors. And end of the day, there were 3 that received at least 3 thumbs up. And you can see them on the screen. Parks and Rec and Fire and EMS were 2 of the 3. They each received 4 thumbs up. Public Health received 3, and we do anticipate doing a study of potential greater sharing or consolidation of the 2 public health departments in Racine County. But for now, the first 2 that were on the docket were to do a deeper dive into Parks and Rec and Fire and EMS. That was essentially our recommendation from this report to the Resilient Communities Roundtable. And the members of the roundtable agreed, yes, we have digested your report, and we see enough potential here that we would agree that this is worth a deeper dive into these 3 areas. So that brings us to this evening. The deeper dives were initiated earlier this year. Again, the reports are being released this evening. I want to start by highlighting the findings of the Parks and Recreation Services study, and then we'll move to Fire and EMS. So, to refresh your memory, these were the individual findings from this September 2018 report. So going into this study, based on a much higher level analysis, we felt that for these 4 areas, cost and efficiency redundancies, potential for service enhancements, so this is clearly an instance where a single municipality is providing service that is beneficial to the larger region in terms of the extensive park system of the city of Racine and high capital replacement costs. Giving you now just some background on the current state. So we, in this case, have each community plus the county itself that owns parks. You can see the numbers on the screen that are detailing the acreage for the various communities, as well as the number of parks and the number of preserves. No surprise to anybody that Racine, given its much larger population, has many more parks and a lot more park acreage. But again, you can see the numbers on the screen. Already there is a good, an example of cooperation in terms of the Caledonia Mount Pleasant Joint Park. When we take a look at spending, this is 2019 budgeted spending on parks and recreation, and for Caledonia, we were not able to sort of separate out recreation from parks. That's why you're seeing that blank. Again, the dollar amounts are somewhat reflective of the number of parks and the amount of park acreage, and certainly reflective of the populations of the different communities. What you'll also notice here is that we listed the cultural institutions, and in the case of the zoo and the art museum, those are owned by the city of Racine, but there is some cost sharing going on in terms of payments by the villages via the wastewater agreement. And so what we're showing you here are the amounts of those payments that are anticipated for 2020. You can see the per capita amounts, and you can see the city of Racine, of course, much higher. So this just gives you a sense of what is going on currently. Summarizing sort of some of our analysis on the current state. So again, we have a situation here where each jurisdiction, including Racine County, owns and maintains its own park assets. That's largely the case in most parts of the state and most parts of the country, but clearly we have seen in other places, Milwaukee County is the perfect example, where about 40 or 50 years ago, the larger parks in each of the municipal governments were actually transferred over to the county, and so Milwaukee County in that case really administers the vast majority of the major parks throughout the county, though municipalities still maintain their own smaller parks, playgrounds, tot lots, etc. In this case, again, we have each of these governments owning and, importantly, maintaining their own park assets. City of Racine uses dedicated staff. So of all of these entities, including the county, City of Racine is the one government that has its own specific parks department with dedicated park staff. What we find in terms of the county and the suburban parks is that their park maintenance staff are actually parts of their Department of Public Works, and so the parks are maintained by highway and public works crews. We do have a case here where certain parks, mostly in the city of Racine, serve the entire region. Obviously, that's, there's many reasons for that. These are regional attractions on the lakefront and so forth. When it comes to the zoo and the art museum, these are obviously serving people throughout the region. The water and sewer payments, as mentioned above, do address some of that financial inequity. A question mark is, should more be done? The final point here is that it also became apparent to us during the course of this study that the demand for not only more parks, but more recreational opportunities is growing in each of the communities. And this, mind you, is before any big influx of population and workforce due to the Foxconn development. And so certainly what stood out is that this planning for new parks and recreation is essentially occurring in each individual community, but is not being coordinated. So that's something that certainly suggested to us an opportunity for some change. In terms of what this study ended up recommending, so I'm skipping through a lot of the analysis, and now I'm going to cut to the chase to tell you about what the conclusions were in terms of parks. We'll get to recreation in just a moment. We thought going in that there may be some real opportunity to recognize some efficiencies by having all maintenance in the parks done by one of the entities. So the logical entities would have been the city of Racine, which again maintains its own large dedicated parks department, or potentially Racine County. We were, however, a little surprised to really conclude that wouldn't necessarily be the case. There's already some very impressive efficiency going on. The fact that the smaller suburban governments and the county use public works staff to also maintain parks actually can be quite efficient. The need for parks maintenance is obviously seasonal. And so we have public works staff that are able to focus more on public works during the non-summer months, but they have the capacity to address the parks maintenance needs during those summer months. And so that's an efficient use of resources. The bottom line is that if you switch that function, if you ask, say, the city of Racine to do the maintenance for the suburban communities, it wouldn't necessarily mean that you could allow the suburban communities to shed staff, because those public works staffers would still be needed for their public works functions. So in this case, we really did not see much of a cost efficiency in terms of doing something different for maintenance. At the same time, we detected very little interest in any type of shift of park ownership or administration, such as the scenario I described in Milwaukee County, where actually park ownership of municipal parks was turned over to the county. So the essential recommendation was, for now, leave that the way it is. That said, again, it's in this planning element. To the extent that we have 4 different municipal governments plus a county government all thinking about ways to expand parks and recreational offerings, it would make a lot of sense to pursue joint planning and possibly joint development. For example, if Caledonia and Mount Pleasant are each considering the need for both new soccer fields and new baseball diamonds, perhaps one of them should do a soccer field and one of them should do a baseball diamond, instead of each of them doing it individually. And I'm obviously using this as a hypothetical example. But in terms of planning for the future, we saw real potential there. Also, and again, this is something that would have to evolve over time, but the possibility of, again, looking at these assets in the region that are truly regional in nature in terms of the people using them, to at least consider designating those as regional assets and coming up with some alternative way to maintain them, administer them, potentially revisit the question of ownership, and also potentially revisit the question of cost sharing. So that's parks. When we think about recreation, and again, the two are very closely related, but what we're showing you here, again, City of Racine provides far more extensive recreational offerings. That said, we have the City of Racine providing recreational offerings, but we are seeing a significant sliver of the users of those recreational services are non-residents. So there's already a certain extent of regionalism going on here. And Racine is not alone. When we looked at the residency of Mount Pleasant program participants, we see an even higher percentage are non-Mount Pleasant residents. So this, again, starts to beg the question, well, maybe we should formalize this, and maybe we should start to view recreation a little more regionally. We also know that the region relies on non-governmental recreation providers. That is much more the case in the suburban communities. Racine Youth Sports is the largest of these. And here, too, we see a mix of users from across the different communities that is not dissimilar from the sort of proportion of population. So what this is giving you is a flavor of the fact that recreation services, in terms of the users of those services, already sort of has a regional tint to them. So one way of sort of getting at, well, is it fair for one community to be providing robust recreational services and paying for those services, but having users from other municipalities? One way to get at that is to have different fees. Indeed, we are seeing that there are some differences in residential and non-residential fees, but there's not big differences there. And we're just giving you for context what the Racine Youth Sports fees are. So wrapping up the current state in terms of recreation, Racine, of course, much more extensive offerings, dedicated staff to recreation as well. There's smaller dedicated staff in the suburban communities. Not surprising that Racine has much more extensive offerings given its greater size and assets. We know that each of the communities has common problems in terms of recruiting and retaining referees and coaches. The suburbs are relying to a greater extent on volunteers, which also becomes more challenging due to a variety of factors. We know that registration and communications pose challenges to each government, as well as to the private sports organizations. So, where do we go from here? We provided a sort of spectrum of options ranging from a least impact to a most impact, starting with keeping the status quo. Let me just go through these briefly for you. So, actually, let me go back to this slide. Status quo, sort of smaller approaches like a joint website, perhaps jointly looking at future planning, all the way up to the formation of an actual quasi-governmental council or body that would coordinate both parks and recreation for the entire region. I want to just leave you with some comments about this notion of a Greater Racine Parks and Recreation Council. And this is not necessarily a recommendation of the study, but it is a suggestion of an approach that be considered. So the notion would be that there would be a council that would be for the Greater Racine community, that would have representation from each of the municipalities, that would be coordinated by county government. And what this council would do is really where I think the work would have to be done going forward, because it could be things as simple as just being a vehicle to jointly plan for improved public access to the existing recreation programs, things like coordinating registration, scheduling, recruiting of training, and training of coaches and referees could potentially be done regionally through this council. This could be a means where citizens could actually testify before the council and comment on recreation service gaps, and that goes for both children and adults. But as we move along the spectrum, there's sort of some more comprehensive things that this council potentially could be empowered to do. Could this be the entity that would jointly plan, that would lead the joint planning for new regional parks and recreation assets? Going a step further, could this be the entity that would actually decide on cost-sharing arrangements? To the extent that there would be a regional planning process for future parks and recreation assets, should there be joint cost-sharing and joint administration and joint maintenance of those new assets going forward? And again, finally, should this council be the entity that would actually do the oversight and the administration? So it sort of, again, gives a spectrum of options even for this one option at the far end of the four previous options that I laid out. One potential way to look at this would be to start small. So maybe the starting point would be to form a council that could really focus initially on recreation, potentially coordinate a landing page on the Racine County website where any citizen of this region could go to gain information about parks and recreation opportunities. Potentially that website could be the place where people register. Doesn't matter which of the different communities, but can register at one place for whatever recreational activity they're looking for. Could this be the place where volunteers could actually be signed up? Could the council coordinate background checks on volunteers? Things like that. Could there be joint trainings coordinated by this council? Each of these governments has certainly challenges in terms of maintaining those volunteer corps and making sure that they have the right training, et cetera. And again, could it then lead to movement on this joint planning and potentially cost sharing for new amenities and or joint administration and cost sharing for those assets, existing assets that would be deemed regional in nature? So again, that's just a brief summary of the highlights of the Park and Recreation Study. We'll take your questions, any questions you may have on that in just a few moments. But I now want to move into the fire and EMS analysis and give you sort of the same flavor in terms of the highlights of that analysis as well. So this is a report cover. Again, this report will be available on the website at 7 o'clock p.m. Refreshing your memory, in 2018, this is how we viewed the 6 factors and the thumbs up versus the thumbs down. So grounding everybody in the current state, this is the location of the fire departments. Of course, we have 3 fire departments in the region: Caledonia, South Shore, and Racine. These are where the stations are located. The South Shore, newly opened South Shore EMS only station is the blue dot. So this just gives you a sense for the geography. In terms of the department comparisons, again, given the population sizes, not surprising to see the much higher dollar figures in Racine, much higher staffing levels. I do need to comment on these per capita numbers. Take them with a little bit of a grain of salt. We did not do a detailed fiscal analysis. We did not take into account factors like who is including outstanding retirement benefits for retirees in their budgets versus centrally. Suffice it to say that Racine and South Shore are very comparable on a per capita basis if we had controlled for all of those things. Caledonia is lower, but there's a very important caveat here too. Caledonia, as many of you are aware, just recently received approval on a federal grant and will be increasing its firefighting staff by 6 staff. During the first 3 years, there'll be an increasing local share for that. But if we were to project out going forward, the Caledonian number would probably end up being much closer to the Racine and South Shore numbers on a per capita basis, assuming that Caledonia is going to fully pay for those positions once the federal grant expires. So again, though, this just gives you a little bit of grounding in the current characteristics of the departments. So when we looked at fire and EMS services, it immediately became apparent to us that there were a series of factors that indicated that yes, there's real potential here for greater sharing and or consolidation. So why is that? First of all, we already have a single dispatch organization handling all 3 agencies. Oftentimes, as we've done these types of studies in other communities, the fact that each has separate dispatch operations is a real barrier to any thought of consolidation. Pay scale and benefit structure for the 3 departments is similar. Not identical by any means. There are certainly variations, but we have seen much larger disparities in other studies that we have done. Here, clearly, there's more similarity. Consolidation of fire departments in this region has been discussed for decades. And of course, the South Shore Fire Department, the merger between Mount Pleasant and Sturtevant, is already demonstrating the benefits of a consolidated department and showing that consolidation in this case can work very well. Why else might greater sharing and or consolidation hold promise? Let's take a look at some of the problems that this could potentially help us solve. There are some irregular municipal boundaries that are creating an illogical response to some locations. So what does that mean? That means that because of the way that municipal boundaries are drawn, there are parts of eastern Mount Pleasant, for example, that actually are closer to a Racine station than a South Shore station, and there are parts of western Racine that are closer to a South Shore station than a Racine station. And so that's just, again, that's not uncommon necessarily, but it's something that does exist here that, hypothetically speaking, a greater service sharing or consolidation approach could address. Each department, and in particular the City of Racine department, faces significant capital needs. In the case of the City of Racine, we're talking about station repair and replacement, and if you combine those costs for the 6 stations, a consulting report released earlier this year indicated we could be talking about the tens of millions of dollars. So again, when we have a situation, and there are also some station needs and some apparatus needs in the other two departments, when we are considering the notion of having each of these three departments having to spend lots of money on new capital, it at least begs the question whether through greater sharing or perhaps consolidation, some of those costs can be reduced going forward. Each department likely will need a new chief within 5 years. So we're not trying to force out any chiefs. I know we have some chiefs here. But again, I don't think it's any secret that there's a possibility that there will be a need for new chiefs. And again, that's just often a reason to at least fathom the notion of talking about getting together. Finally, 2 of the 3 departments have a need to enhance firefighter staff. Now, there's plans underway to do that. I mentioned Caledonia and the receipt of the federal grant. For South Shore, there are plans to build another station close to the Foxconn development, and there's a funding source there through the tax incremental district. Nonetheless, when we see 2 of 3 departments needing to enhance staff, it at least begs the question, might a strategic redeployment of existing staff, if you are all one department, might that actually obviate that need and potentially not only save some dollars, but result in a more effective and efficient deployment of staff? So those are opportunities. Clearly, there are also challenges that we identified right off the bat. This fact that Caledonia's costs are lower than the other 2, it's not a terrible obstacle, but it has to be considered to the extent that we would think about creating a single department that would have a level of service that matches the SSFD and RFD. That may require Caledonia to have to pay more. You try to sort of level that out on a per capita basis. And so, again, that would be up to the elected officials from Caledonia, whether that would be palatable and whether the benefit they would get in terms of better service would exceed the negative of the higher costs. Each of the departments in this case has different motivations and need for change. So again, we have South Shore that needs to accommodate Foxconn. We have Caledonia that has identified the need for more firefighting staff. We have Racine with these really onerous capital costs looking toward the future. And so, again, could you sort of mold all of those together and create a win-win through greater service sharing or consolidation? We have the issue of just different staffing models. Caledonia and Racine use 3-person ambulance crews. South Shore Fire Department and most of the rest of the country use 2-person crews. I'm not here to argue whether one is a better approach than the other, but when you have different departments with different operational frameworks, that can often make it more difficult to promote greater collaboration and or consolidation. The union contracts, again, there's lots of similarities, but there are also differences in the union contracts, and figuring all that out is a big step if you are to really look closely at consolidation. Finally, the impact of this Foxconn TIF, the fact that this TIF has been created and that Mount Pleasant has the ability for South Shore to use dollars from the TIF to pay for the expansion it needs. I don't know that I deem it a barrier, but it's a complication. If we were to look at a 2-way or a 3-way consolidation here, well, how would that work? So again, we just cite it as something that would be another issue that might complicate any consideration of consolidation. So, end of the day, the report, again, laid out a spectrum of options. I want to very briefly go through those before getting to our questions. First of all, the status quo. So I really should have mentioned this at the very beginning. We have been engaged in fire and EMS service sharing studies where the driver for the study is a recognition that the service levels are insufficient, inappropriate, big public safety concerns. I can't underline anymore that that's not the case in this community. We have 3 departments that are providing high-quality service, that are rated well in terms of the insurance ISO ratings, that really have tailored their service to their individual communities. So there is no crisis here. There is no overriding impetus to do something based on the fact that existing service levels are insufficient or inappropriate. But, and of course there's a but here, but there are some sort of lingering issues and challenges that suggest that perhaps the status quo does need to change. So again, we've been through them. There's the substantial population growth and development, not only from Foxconn, but from all of the other ancillary development and growth that is hoped to occur with regard to Foxconn. We have this massive capital need for Racine. We have the fact that Caledonia has recognized the need to add staff, has laudably gone after some federal grant dollars to do it, but those grant dollars run out after 3 years, and so cost is an issue there. We have some poor response times due to, again, the fact that we have municipal boundaries dictating who responds as opposed to potentially the closest and most appropriate unit. And we are seeing increasing call volumes. We are seeing EMS call volumes increase in many areas around the state because of aging populations and because of just the way people access health care. In this case, it's also the hoped-for population growth and job growth resulting from Foxconn and related development. So all of these are factors that would suggest that maybe by collaborating more, there are ways to address some of these issues and that perhaps the status quo should not continue. Now, as I showed in the previous slide, there are various adjustments to the status quo that can be contemplated here. So, first, there's a group of sort of immediate actions that are completely distinct from any talk of consolidating departments that could be pursued by these 3 departments as 3 individual departments. And again, there's a range here, much like the Parks and Rec study, and it sort of starts from least significant to more significant. Things like group purchasing of apparatus and supplies and so forth is something, a small thing that maybe could save a little money, result in a little greater efficiency, and also promote greater cooperation overall. Expanded fire and technical training among the 3 departments. Looking at joint training and a joint training facility could be something which also might be beneficial given the extent to which these 3 departments already depend upon one another for mutual aid, trying to ensure that training protocols and so on are more consistent by doing more joint training could be an immediate action that could produce some service level improvement. Switch to 2-person ambulances. This is an issue that is certainly not a cut and dried issue, but both Caledonia and the city of Racine have a staffing framework that relies on 3-person ambulances. And hypothetically speaking, if there was a desire to have more ambulances in service, and or if there was a desire to reduce some costs, that a switch to 2-person ambulances is something that either of those communities could hypothetically pursue, again, without any mention of going any further in terms of consolidation. We have Station 10. So Station 10 is the joint station. It's the station that's shared between Caledonia and South Shore. The agreement says that each of the departments has to have 3 people at the station. We looked at call volumes for the surrounding area, and certainly a case could be made that to have, instead of 6 individuals, 3 from each community, having just 4 people at that station who would service the radius around the station regardless of municipality could provide an opportunity to then redeploy 2 shifts to elsewhere in either service area that has the demand that justifies that. So reaching an agreement, and this we know was an issue that was considered previously, reaching a long-term agreement on that is something that, again, would have nothing to do with consolidating the departments, that could allow for some redeployment of existing resources in a more effective way. There's a concept that we refer to as dynamic resource deployment, a concept whereby right now, again, because of municipal boundaries, if there's a lot of activity going on at one of the Racine stations and there's a need for backup at that station, it right now has to essentially come from another Racine station. Well, maybe it could come from a South Shore station or a Caledonia station instead. And so the notion that there'd just be greater backup and backfilling during times of heavy call volumes, regardless of municipal boundary, is something that hypothetically could be pursued, again, that has nothing to do with consolidation. Finally, this move to a closest unit response. So we have seen situations in other parts of the country and other parts of the state where, again, independent fire and rescue departments remain, but municipal boundaries are essentially torn down, and when a call comes in, the closest and most appropriate unit responds, regardless of whether that unit is from the municipality in which the call originated. This would certainly take negotiation among the departments. We certainly wouldn't want to see a situation where one of the three departments was called on much more extensively to respond to calls in another municipality. There's issues regarding reimbursement on EMS calls. But still, this is something that hypothetically could be done to address this problem of these pockets. Here you can see, and I know this is very tough for you to see on this screen, but you can see the eastern part right on the lake of Mount Pleasant, where we have calls coming in, and the southernmost Racine station is closer than the closest Mount Pleasant station. We have parts of Elmwood Park that are served by South Shore, but that hypothetically could be better served by the Racine station. So if you did a closest and most appropriate response type of framework, this could produce better response times for, again, some relatively small selected areas of the region. We then looked at consolidation options, either a two-way consolidation or three-way consolidation, in terms of just the general benefits that we often see in terms of a consolidated fire department. The larger workforce can be very beneficial. It can reduce the need for overtime, which can be very important. Right now, in a small department, if somebody wrenched their knee and can't come in, that often requires somebody else to have to come in and be paid overtime. If you have a larger department, if all of the stations I showed you on that initial map are part of one department, it may be that there's a resource at a different station within that larger department that could be transferred over, and you don't have to use overtime. Another benefit of a larger department is the opportunity to develop more career ladders and to potentially even compensate more, which aids in recruitment and retention. This notion of closest and most appropriate response, it just happens if you're consolidated. You don't have to worry about that negotiation. You don't have to worry about one of the three departments being overtaxed, et cetera. So we can get these benefits of both the dynamic resource deployment and closest and most appropriate response. Having a single structure for command, administration, training, and special functions can be both cost efficient and, again, can result in some service level improvements. If everybody is trained to the same protocols, that can result in more cohesiveness at the scene of an incident, just as an example. This opportunity to redeploy the existing workforce based on actual demand. So in this case, if there was a consolidation, there wouldn't be a need for a negotiation between the South Shore communities and Caledonia about the 6 people on staff at that Station 10. Whoever is the chief would deploy the resources to where demand suggests they need to be deployed. And so that just happens when you have a larger consolidated department. Finally, there's the possible reduction of both apparatus and stations. And so, again, we did not do the type of detailed analysis that would certainly indicate at this point that any of the stations could be eliminated, but certainly in terms of apparatus, the fact that you don't have 3 individual departments each needing backup apparatus, the fact that you may not need as many engines or ladder trucks to serve the region as a whole as you do to serve 3 individual service areas, that's often an area of savings. We looked at both 2- and 3-way consolidation options. In terms of 2-way, we felt that South Shore and Caledonia are the likeliest partners. That's not trying to make a value judgment, but clearly there is a 20-year history of sharing resources and of cooperating via that shared Station 10. We found in our discussions with the chiefs that the work culture, the pay scales, the benefits are more comparable among these 2 departments, and we have both of these communities anticipating growth. Now, Racine and Caledonia also could be considered for a 2-way consolidation. In that case, it would likely involve Caledonia actually contracting with the much larger City of Racine department for service, much the way some of the smaller communities in the region are contracting for service with some of the larger departments. So we looked at these options briefly. Clearly, some of the benefits that I spoke about earlier in terms of the general benefits would apply here. You'd have some savings from eliminating a chief position and from potentially being able to eliminate some administrative costs. You'd have that joint training, et cetera, among the two departments. You would have the potential for apparatus savings, and again, you'd have this opportunity to reposition existing resources that could potentially reduce Caledonia's expansion need in the two other stations besides Station 10 if we were talking about a Caledonia South Shore merger. But there are potential barriers, and again, do not want to convey that this is a recommendation to do this because there are challenges involved and it may not be right. Loss of local control is a serious issue here, and so really I think a key decision for elected officials is whether whether the benefits you get from doing this exceed whatever detriment you may view from losing complete control. Clearly, under the Sturtevant Mount Pleasant South Shore agreement, there's joint governance over that department. We'd clearly be talking about joint governance in any circumstance, but that is different from individual governance. There's currently a collective bargaining impasse in Caledonia, so it's not clear how that might impact any talk of a two-way consolidation. And in the end of the day, could an equitable agreement be reached on how you would share the cost? In the case of a Caledonia South Shore consolidation, I mean, there's a good model in place for the way that that Sturtevant and Mount Pleasant share costs and have provided for joint governance. Hypothetically speaking, Caledonia could simply be added to that agreement, but still, that would have to be negotiated and worked out. Finally, in terms of a three-way consolidation, again, I've outlined the general benefits, many of which would apply, we believe, in this circumstance. We do believe that the opportunity potentially to strategically redeploy both apparatus and staff across a larger service area with all of these existing stations could eliminate or defer the need for much of the staff expansion. And that may include the additional staffing that's going to be needed for the new station close to Foxconn. It's possible that the resources already exist within the region. If you could redeploy them strategically because you're now all together, that you could reduce that need. Again, the opportunity to maximize the benefits of closest unit response, dynamic resource deployment. Certainly, we think there would be some savings here with reduced leadership side and on the apparatus side. And again, there is the possibility that we didn't dive into deeply about could you get by with one fewer station in the city of Racine, because again, you're sharing within the broader geographic area, which obviously could reduce those costs. That said, there are barriers. There are cultural differences among the three departments, which would have to be worked out. Just differences, again, the two-person versus three-person ambulances is a perfect example. Again, here too, and if you're talking about three players and forming a joint department, reaching agreement on equitable cost sharing would be a challenge. The issues related to collective bargaining and trying to mold together three different firefighter unions and union contracts would be certainly a challenge as well. We say here the cost of leveling up. The way that this typically occurs, and the greatest example is in Milwaukee County's North Shore, where there is a very successful consolidated department. The philosophy there was that when they were trying to bring together, in that case, believe it or not, 7 union contracts, that sort of the highest level was the one that would be implemented for the consolidated department. Well, if that were to happen, then it's possible that there would be an increased cost associated with that. And finally, again, of course, the loss of local control. So I am done. Covered a lot of information. Thank you. So we're largely on time. We have a good 40 minutes now where we can take questions. As the county executive said at the beginning, the questions will be limited to elected officials. I'm going to call my colleague, Paul Bishop, up to the stage. If you have any difficult questions, I'll turn those right over to Paul. But seriously, Paul is actually the primary author of the fire and EMS study. Paul happens to be a trained paramedic, so he not only talks the talk, but has walked the walk. And it's just a tremendous resource for us to be able to bring in to conduct this analysis. So again, we are ready to field your questions. So I just ask you to raise your hand. Now, there are folks walking around with microphones, so we're going to wait till the microphone gets to you when you have a question. But pardon the pun, fire away.
Or we can say that was a great report and we've got it all answered.
Yeah. No questions. I guess everybody's hungry and wants to get to the hors d'oeuvres. Here, we have a question from this gentleman here. 2 questions. All right, now we're rolling.
Thank you very much for being here. So in regards to the first part of the presentation, you were talking about Parks and Rec. There were some recommendations about midway through that portion of it that looked as though they were going to get a little more specific. Are more specifics available in the full report online? Are there dollars called out there at all?
So there is more specificity in the report, certainly, but dollars are not called out. And for the most part, again, it would have been difficult for us to put a fiscal note behind some of these things. A lot of it depends on what you would, if you're talking specifically about the Park and Recreation Council, what would be the charge of that body? If it is a start small, where you're just trying to jointly administer information and registration and so forth, I think the question there would be, to the extent that if the county is organizing that, it would incur costs. A, would it want to charge some portion of those costs or all of those costs back out to the munis? And B, how would it do it? But for the most part, a lot of those suggestions would not really have a cost associated with them. Now, to the extent that we would get to the point of planning for new assets, again, planning does cost a little money, so there'd have to be discussion. Who would pay for the planners or for the agencies or sewer pack or whoever to do that? We just don't know at this point.
Okay, thank you. And then the second question in regards to the fire and EMS portion. I'm assuming that you spent significant time with the fire chiefs and others in the fire and EMS service.
Yep, so I'll let Paul.
Yeah, so what was the reaction? I think I'm probably asking more about practicality, things of that nature, from those individuals, people who are working every day that really know if this is feasible.
So I think one of the ways to answer that question is if you had a clean slate in you're approaching 2020 and you had to provide the service to these communities today and you didn't have an existing fire service, an existing EMS service, would you create one for 2020 that looks the way it does right now? And the answer was no. That there are opportunities for efficiency, there are opportunities to share services that the different chiefs, that the different folks we spoke with identified. Now, that said, trying to create a large, going from the status quo to a full consolidation is a big step. It's one that can be taken, it's one that has been taken in different communities, and you have to identify what's the motivation for it. Are we able to get that higher level of service for that same cost? I would argue yes, you could. Everyone had a little bit different perspective of what they would change. That's kind of how you start the conversation. What would you change? What would you keep the same? And there were things that you would want to keep the same. You do, as Rob mentioned, have a really high level of service. Whatever change we made, we want to make sure we wouldn't degrade that type of service. But we would want to try and find some of those efficiencies, and we bring out in the report some of the things that we identified.
But just to reassure you, and I want to thank the chiefs. And I'm seeing 2 of them here. I'm not seeing Chief Hansen, but maybe I'm not seeing him. But
He's there.
Oh, sorry, Chief. I got this light in my eyes, so I couldn't see you. Again, I just want to thank them. I mean, these are not easy conversations, and everybody is rightly very proud of the service they're providing. And That said, we met on a couple of occasions with all three of the chiefs. Paul spent extensive time individually with them. He went out and toured stations and so forth, and very cooperative, very thoughtful. And I guess I would just echo that. I don't think anybody said we shouldn't make any changes here. Different opinions on different types of changes, but I think also all three chiefs expressing a willingness to, yeah, let's roll up our sleeves and let's see what is doable here. Yes.
Thank you. I wanted to know, are there different protocols for response in the various municipalities with a fire truck when an EMS call comes in? Does a fire truck go along with it in every municipality, or is it in just one?
In general, the answer is you're always getting a paramedic level ambulance, and for the more severe calls, a first responding fire truck, often with a paramedic on board, would be going as well. So that's the general situation. Occasionally there's, because of high levels of demand, you might have an EMT ambulance initial before the paramedic ambulance comes in, but that's really a rarity. The level of service across the three is essentially equivalent. However, the difference, some of the South Shore ambulances have two-person crews, and both Caledonia and Racine have three-person crews. So that is on their ambulances, and that is a significant level difference between the two.
Does that provide better service, or what is the rationale for having a third person or not having a third person?
So Rob gave a little bit of an introduction. I've been, and I am a paramedic, been doing it for 25 years, and I have almost always worked on a two-person ambulance crew. And that is really a standard across the country. There are reasons where you need more than two people on an ambulance, on an EMS scene, when you have a critical patient where you need a lot of help. On a routine basis, it is probably having a three-person crew is a luxury, and you can do it effectively with two people. There are times where you need more. In particular, the way the fire departments are staffed in Caledonia and Racine, the three-person crew on the ambulance has a dual-purpose role of also staffing firefighting apparatus or having a firefighting role at a scene. So they need that three-person crew for that role as well as for the EMS role. And the chiefs could speak a little bit more articulately as to why they use that three-person crew. They have their rationale for it, and I understand it, and I can also professionally disagree with it and say that you could do it with two people.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for giving your presentation. I thought it was very good. A couple examples I think that maybe, I don't know if they're all going to be listed in the report for the fire EMS would be, I think probably Johnson Park, which is in the Caledonia sector, and the dog park. Is that correct? Is something that we would respond to as in Caledonia?
From a fire and rescue perspective,
Yes, EMS. As the closest station, because they're in so far in. I mean, we've talked about that
Right.
over the years.
Yep, so again, knowing
So
the
are those
geography,
kind
my assumption is that yes, there could be a closest
Okay,
unit.
so I just want to give a couple examples so they
Yep.
weren't given. I don't know if they're in the report.
The specific examples in the report, because we actually looked at call volumes, and Paul can speak to this better, but again, the eastern part of Mount Pleasant, the western part of Racine, we know what the call volume is there. We know where roughly the proportion would be if there was a closest and most appropriate unit. I think it was about 60-40 in terms of Racine responding to incidents in Mount Pleasant versus South Shore responding to incidents in Racine. But that's speculative. It also depends on which units are out at any given time and so forth.
Thank you. I'm going to ask for our chiefs to at least to address that 3 persons so that everybody else here knows that. I've got one more question for you, though.
Well, so I just want to be clear that the format here, so there will be presentations to each of the boards individually. The format here was not to have anyone but elected officials speak.
Okay, that's fine, thank you. But I have one more question for you then. Back to the parks, if we talk on that. Was there any thought that went into, City of Racine has the largest acreage to take care of, but as you mentioned, was I think Milwaukee County that took over everybody's. Was there any thought process that each community could take over, could control their own park system, and keep their own identity, and potentially have a park, whether it be the county park or parks that are in that municipality, have that municipality take those over? Was that a thought?
I'm sorry, so have them take over the maintenance?
Yes, we would, the municipality would take over the county park.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
Instead of the county taking over
Yes.
the municipality's
Yes.
park.
So we did, given that, again, City of Racine has the full-time dedicated Parks Department. Racine County does not. They have a Parks Division within the Highway Department, but essentially have public works workers maintaining parks. We did look at whether it would make sense for the City of Racine, for example, to do the maintenance of county parks within the city. There too, we found that there wouldn't really be cost savings for the county because it's not as if the county could eliminate staff positions if relieved of that duty, and ostensibly there would have to be, the county would ostensibly pay the city, so it could actually add cost for the county. So we looked at it, and we didn't do an intensive enough analysis so that I could tell you, precisely here's what the dollars would look like, but we didn't see a lot there in terms of a cost savings and an efficiency.
Okay, and you also touched on the fact that each municipality has, for lack of better terms, has all their own, like we have soccer fields in Caledonia.
Yep.
We have baseball diamonds in Caledonia. We don't have, per se, a indoor sports complex that would be, amenable to basketball, things of that nature. City of Racine does. They've got soccer fields. They've got baseball diamonds. In Mount Pleasant, they've got the same things that we would have access to. So, since we don't have the indoor recplex like Mount Pleasant does, whichever in that area, would we be able? Was there anything that was thought about of utilizing potentially a unified building?
Absolutely, and
Unified schools?
So that's the whole concept here about viewing recreation regionally, having an overriding council to potentially administer recreation services. And so then it doesn't matter whether the indoor facility is located in Mount Pleasant, wouldn't really matter to a Caledonian.
My question, I didn't go far enough. Unified school district, using one of their buildings,
Okay.
their recreation, their gymnasium,
Yep.
to play basketball.
So we did not look at the potential connection on recreation with the Racine Unified School District. That said, and again, knowing Milwaukee County and the fact that actually in the city of Milwaukee, Milwaukee Rec is located within the Milwaukee Public Schools, that is another certainly potential area to be explored. It was not within the scope of this analysis, but I'm very glad you brought it up because I'll just give you an opinion. I think it absolutely ought to be on the table, that we did not look at school district recreational resources and the potential opportunity to fold that into an overriding regional recreational approach. But again, if you had a council, those are the types of issues that could be easily looked at.
No, thank you. You did an awesome presentation.
Thank you. Question here.
Need the other mic.
Yeah. We're down to one mic.
Oh, there we go.
Hello? Okay.
Great.
So as you looked at the fire restructuring, some of the things that were brought to my attention was, would this be something that would entail an independent fire commission that would be responding to fires? Is this something that the county would take over? What kind of organizational structure, like an independent fire commission with taxing authority, what was some of the thinking behind what was going on here to be able to get all the fire departments together to respond and be more efficient and economical?
So we did not get into the level of saying, if you were to do this and combine the three departments, what would be your options in terms of a governance structure? So I think that would be a next step. If there's real interest in looking at this, the immediate things to really dive into is, how would you want to set up a governance structure? How would you want to set up a cost allocation formula? What would you want to do on this overriding question of the number of stations you would need? That said, I mean, there's the notion that you would have an independent consolidated department with its own taxing authority. I'm pretty certain that would require a change in state law. The model that would obviously be looked at would be the North Shore Fire Department. It's not only the prime example of a successful consolidated department in southeast Wisconsin, it's known nationally. And the structure there is that it is an independent governmental unit. There is a governing board that consists of one representative from each of the 7 communities. That was a very difficult decision. You have Little River Hills with 1,700 citizens having the same representation on the board as bigger Glendale with 14,000. For a variety of reasons, that's the way they decided to go. It's working well. There's a cost allocation formula that has been developed. But essentially, the independent fire department bills each of the individual municipalities for its share of the next year's operating costs per the mutually agreed upon cost allocation formula. And then there's a slightly separate formula on the capital side. So you do not have the department levying taxes, you have the municipalities using a share of their property tax levy that they have to feed into the department to be a participant in the department. So I don't want to say that's the way it would have to work here, but in a community this size, that would probably be the logical way, though I don't know, Paul, do you know of other models that?
No, I think that's been working, and don't reinvent the wheel if you don't need to.
Thank you very much. Trevor from Racine. First off, my question relates to savings. There's a large disparity, obviously, between the city of Racine and our surrounding communities in terms of its tax rates. So what would you say in terms of the actions that you've recommended will lead to reducing that disparity to make sure that there's more savings, number one? Then I have a comment after your question.
So without having done the in-depth fiscal analysis that would be a next step, and that we are actually now beginning to noodle on some numbers, I can't give you a precise answer, because again, we don't know how the cost allocation would take place. We know that for the North Shore Fire Department, it's based on 3 equally weighted factors. It's population, it's equalized value, it's call volume. And that is how the formula is developed. And so you'd have to take a look at what would be the total cost of a consolidated department. If you allocated that cost based on that type of a formula, what would be the payment for each of the 4 communities, and how would that compare to their current costs? And that's a pretty complicated financial analysis. What I will say is that, to the extent that you look at the 141 individuals who work for the 3 departments, is that the right number?
It's a little higher than that.
Okay, I may be off. I'm trying to remember.
I'll tell you in a second.
Okay. If you took the combined resources of those departments and you deployed them differently based on things like where does call volume demand more staff and more apparatus, and if you were then able to determine, for example, that you have the resources or close to the resources you need right now to staff the future need, you would potentially be looking at some savings. And given that the city of Racine is the largest governmental body that is spending the most it would probably recognize the largest percentage of those savings. So what I'm trying to say to you is that hypothetically speaking, yeah, we think there would be a savings. We think that Racine could experience a savings. We think that to the extent that consolidation just makes it easier for a variety of reasons to look at shifting from the 3-person ambulances to the 2. It may be that because, again, you have this larger staff and this strategic deployment capability, that may make it easier and more justifiable to just have a 2-person ambulance staffing model across the board. Then that would certainly either A, produce savings, or B, result in more ambulances being in service throughout the community. Either way, there's a benefit to all the communities, but also if indeed there's a dollar savings, if that results in a reduction in staff, then hypothetically speaking, more of those savings would go to Racine.
And 238 firefighters.
Sorry, yes.
You had the number for Racine itself, which is 141.
Okay, I knew that. I at least had one correct number stick in my head.
Excellent. And just a brief comment. So I want to thank the work of the Policy Forum and for the Johnson Foundation on prioritizing collaboration. And we also have a large issue that we're confronting in the Racine metro region, which is racial equity. Racine was listed the 2nd worst community in the country for African Americans. And I think that as we continue these discussions about resilient communities and how we can better deliver services with more efficiency, that needs to be on our minds as we continue these discussions. And I think that your organization is going to be a perfect resource as we look to address those concerns. So thank you.
Thank you. I think we have one over there.
Hi, good evening. Ram Bhatia, Mount Pleasant. Great presentation. Obviously, you present the benefits, of the consolidation. My question is, do you have experience that the counties and the municipalities who have actually gone through the process, and not only the process, but they actually have done that? Can you share with us which other counties in Wisconsin have implemented, and if so, what were their experiences vis-a-vis the cost and also the governing structure? How did they do that? Because this to me is the first step. So unless I missed that discussion, if you have any example, please share with us.
So there aren't a lot of examples of fire department consolidation in Wisconsin. In fact, the 2 I always cite, and we're doing studies around, so there's lots of studies going on. You're not unique there. But the 2 that I always cite are North Shore and your very own South Shore.
So do I hear that if any of these the proposals are taken up by all or few of the municipalities, Racine County would be the first one? Is that correct?
Not the first. Well, if you count South Shore, it would be the 3rd one. So we have done an exhaustive analysis of the North Shore Fire Department. So we were commissioned upon its 20th anniversary back in 2015 to quantify what were the financial savings that resulted from that decision 20 years earlier, and what were the service level outcomes. And so there's a report on our website that I would urge any of you just go to research and type in North Shore and you'll see the report. But I can tell you, again, I'm diving into my memory, but I know this number well. We were able to quantify that the 7 communities in Milwaukee County's North Shore in 2015 would have collectively been spending $2.8 million more than they were spending for the North Shore Fire Department if, and this is a big if each of the 7 communities had individually ramped itself up to achieve the same level of service as the North Shore. So I'd caution you. I mean, it's difficult to talk about cost savings without also talking about what's your level of service. In the case of Caledonia, if being part of a consolidated department would address the pressures it's feeling on its own to expand staffing, the question is not, okay, would our payment toward a consolidated department be more or less than what we're paying today? It's, would our payment toward a consolidated department be more or less what we would have to pay on our own to get up to the same level of service that we would enjoy by being part of a consolidated department? And in that case, the answer is almost always that there are dollar savings. And again, we were able to show that for the North Shore. I live in Bayside. Bayside has 4,500 citizens. For Little Bayside to have brought its little department up to the level of service that the North Shore is providing me would have been prohibitively expensive on its own, and it probably never would have done it. And so that's a value judgment. That's why you guys all get the big bucks, because you need to decide whether any additional expense is justifiable based on the benefit you would get. And if you don't perceive that there's a need to ramp up your service, then it's a more difficult decision for you potentially if you're Caledonia. Now, Racine's in a different position. Racine's in a position where, it has these big costs on the horizon, particularly on the capital side. So then there's a question, well, gee, by joining together with our neighbors, might we be able to avoid some of those costs? But, arguably, Racine currently has the level of service that it would get by being part of a consolidated department. So it's a different calculus for everybody.
Thank you. How did the North Shore group overcome their territorial instincts? Was it money and savings?
So, boy, I hate to say what I'm about to say, but it took 10 years at least from the beginning of the discussion about forming a consolidated North Shore Fire Department until it actually happened. There were two main drivers that finally put it over the top. Number one was that there were two high-profile incidents, big fires in the North Shore, that demanded a mutual aid response from not only all of the North Shore departments, but also the city of Milwaukee. And at the scene of the incidents, the coordination was lacking. The chiefs came right out and said that our effectiveness was diminished by the fact that we were individual departments with our own training protocols, our own equipment, not used to working closely together. And two separate times it happened within a matter of a couple of years. So that was one of the key drivers. Another one of the key drivers was particularly some of the smaller departments were leaning more and more heavily on the city of Milwaukee for mutual aid, and the city of Milwaukee said it was going to start to put its foot down. And whether that meant somehow charging or just not being as readily available. So that was another impetus for action.
Thank you.
I see a question over there. What's the time?
Sorry, my voice is kind of gone, so I'm going to try really hard. So in response to your comment about mutual aid between departments, in your analysis, did you figure out what the mutual aid was between the departments and how often mutual aid was needed?
We do. I can't put that off the top of my head. There is regular exchange of mutual aid between each other. Particularly for larger profile events, house fires, that happens as needed. For the smaller scale, the EMS type events, which really are 75% or more of the action of the fire departments, it does occur when the resources are tapped. They will call on their neighbors. Again, it's in the report as to the percentage and the number of times it happens.
Probably have time for one or two more if there are any other questions. Jim?
I've got a question. I know you've worked on some consolidations on the East Coast, I believe.
What would be our next step now? Who should get in the room and start to really drill down on this? A fire chief from each department get together, along with a union representative, a trustee, an alderman, a working group? Or do we all just sit in our own little corners and come out with a recommendation? What's your next step of what we want to try to do?
So I think you really want to build off of the Resilient Communities Roundtable that you've already been meeting at, with the invitation then extended out one more to the fire chiefs and to someone from the labor unions to begin to talk about it in that perspective. So I would take the tables that you've already been meeting around and extend the invitation a little bit, and then really identify what are going to be the key challenges. I'll tell you, it's not the operational things. The fire chiefs already know how to work together. The firefighters already work together on the streets on a daily basis. It's the things along collective bargaining, taking a look at the union contracts and figuring out where are those, what are the pinch points there, what are the things that are going to have to be decided upon with some sort of consolidated department. Those are the ones you want to begin to highlight and go through and say, okay, this clause is one that we've got to think about. And identify what are the priorities of the community. And if you really want to take a look at, okay, we want everything east of 94 to be served together, to get the best possible service we can deliver for no more than we're spending today, what do we need to make that happen? I think establishing that as a goal would be something you'd want to do at the outset. Rob, I don't know if you want to.
Yep, no, I would agree. And, and again, part of it is, what are we solving for here? Going back to the 6 criteria, and going back to the challenges that we cited, it's like, which are the ones that we want to check off first and really try to address what's most important to us, and that might dictate how you would move forward and whether you'd want to look at one of the real comprehensive options that we laid out versus starting small. And again, we can't make that judgment, but I think getting the folks that Paul cited in a room together would help you to get there.
And I think some of the things we identify as kind of those immediate actions, one is developing responses that are irregardless of municipal boundaries, that you're using the closest, most appropriate unit. That's something that could be done very quickly. My understanding is that it was a signature or two away from happening a few years ago, and then it got pulled back. So figure out why it got pulled back, and let's move it forward again, because that's something your citizens deserve. They shouldn't have to wait for the ambulance from their town to show up if it's a mile or two further away than the closest available ambulance. If it's my loved one, I don't want that to happen. So I think that's something people can understand. You can really get to that point that, when we have somebody in need, we shouldn't be waiting just because of the name on the side of the vehicle. We want that closest one. You have the technology to do it. You now need the political will to do it.
And I would just add that a related step, so the several of the fire chiefs in Milwaukee County actually took it upon themselves to just negotiate an agreement. No dollars had to change hands, no intergovernmental agreements had to be signed, but they are now backfilling stations across municipal boundaries. So if one of the greenfield stations is under some real heavy call volume and the ambulance is out, then Milwaukee may be able to either physically send an ambulance and its own staff to physically be located at the greenfield station until the greenfield station staff can return, which eliminates the need to call anybody in on overtime, or they're close enough that they can say, look, we're going to cover you here so you don't have to worry, and so forth. So there are even things like that hypothetically could be worked out that could just result in a more seamless operation.
Thank you. I can't see you, so I'll stand up. John Tate, City of Racine. My question was, and I may have missed it at the beginning, but how did the focus of the study end up being consolidating services or, finding efficiencies for those sorts of things?
For both or just for?
At all, period. Like, how did that become the focus of the study?
Yep. So very important to say that, looking at service sharing and consolidation is a strategy that is one of dozens of strategies that could be looked at to try to promote this principle of resiliency. So I'm going to leave it for the folks at the Johnson Foundation they can describe much better than I what it means to be a resilient community. I mean, I think we sort of all have a sense for it. It's that, there are some challenges facing the greater Racine region, and the notion is that by acting together to address those challenges, you'll have better outcomes than if you go it alone. So, but service sharing was seen as, one of the earliest places to look. Because again, it can be a strategy to promote resiliency to the extent that you are providing better public services at lower costs. That makes you more competitive as a region, that maybe helps you with some of your economic challenges. But also it was seen as, hey, here's an area where we think there's real potential to start to establish this mindset of working together. So I think it was for those two reasons that service sharing and consolidation was one of the areas, but clearly there are other things that can and that are being looked at as vehicles to promote resiliency.
Okay. And part of the reason I ask that is because I remember the initial Resilient Communities conversation, and one of the impetuses for it is identifying crises as a driving factor for communities becoming resilient and addressing issues. And if we look at the last 3 years, my friend from the 9th District in Racine, Trevor Young, mentioned the last 3 years, this region has been identified as the worst, top 5 for African Americans. So if we're talking about crises and resolving those issues, it seems like all the resources, certainly those from the Johnson Foundation and Wisconsin Policy Forum, might be focused on that particular crisis as opposed to whether we consolidate fire stations. So I'm concerned, that's why I asked, is where's that come from? Because if it was a body of elected leaders saying, let's focus on this, that's a concern for me. If it comes from somebody else who's invested in the values of the community, that's also a concern for me because they've overlooked this major crisis in the region. So hopefully everyone who's in this room is leaving this place, and hopefully I'm the last commenter, with we work together to address that particular crisis. Because it doesn't matter how many units we consolidate and how much tax savings we get, if 10% of our residents are identified as living in the worst place for them, that's a problem for every single one of us. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question if there is one. Right there.
Gary Feast, Mount Pleasant. This study is going to be online, and you said it digs a lot deeper in it, so it behooves me to, study that out before I ask. But, the general feeling I get with what you're doing here is there's a television show about a contractor who walks into a home where a contractor did some work. I don't want to mention the name of the show, but he goes in there and says, oh, this should have been done better. And then he proceeds to furnish a beautiful renovation for those people. It sounds like that's kind of what you guys are trying to do here with the fire department and the parks department, but the overriding elephant in the room is always the dollars. And you even admit that if we were to consolidate, there may not be cost savings. I tend to agree with that because I know, at least from our municipality standpoint, we could use another 2, possibly 3 fire stations fully staffed to cover lacking in our municipality, and I'm sure it's probably the same situation with them. So I applaud the idea of what you're trying to drive to, but my question is, when you're actually getting down to the nuts and bolts of these studies and everything else, you say you don't delve into the financial aspects. I think that's kind of like putting the boat in the water, or putting the boat, there's no water for the boat. So I think that is really something, if we're going forward, that has to be a major component of the discussion, because it's very easy to build a deck if you've got $400,000 to spend, but if you've only got $40,000, you have to figure it out. And that's what I'd really appreciate, or at least get your opinion on these studies without the financials. it's like a three-legged table. Something's missing. Can you address why you generally don't delve into the financial aspect when I feel it's probably the main component of most of these discussions?
So it's a great question, and it's one we wrestle with all of these. So, it's a catch-22. So to the extent that we would want to do an in-depth fiscal analysis, any analysis would have to model what a consolidated department would look like, whether we're talking a two-way or a three-way. And modeling that consolidated department would involve having the modelers make very subjective judgments on things like, should we close some stations? Should we go down to two-person ambulances? And so forth. We elected not to do that at this juncture because A, we did not think it was appropriate to have that type of subjectivity right now, but B, because very clearly we're laying out a range of options. I'm not prepared to say to you that you should, disregard all of the smaller scale options and move right into looking at a three-way consolidation. I think you all need to chew on that first. We were also concerned that if we gave you the financials on a consolidated department, that it would look like we were pushing that approach. All that said, your very wise leaders who participate in the roundtable anticipated that there would be questions like this. And so we now have been tasked to start to do some financial modeling. So I think the chain of events here is absorb this, chew on it, think about it, but we are going to be following up with some more specific financial information. So we are now at the point of the program where I want to call up the 4 municipal representatives from the Resilient Communities Roundtable. If you've been wondering why all these stools are here, that's why. And we're going to allow each of them to make closing statements.
Hi, again, Jim Dobbs from Caledonia, the president. I would just like to thank the Johnson Foundation again for bringing us together. And their intense concern for this community is shown every day when we go out there to talk about these items and how they've underwritten the cost of the great studies that he's doing and is continuing to do, as we just mentioned about the financials about this as we move forward and what we may want to look further at. It's interesting to note that all of this started well before the Foxconn came here. We started talking about this and other issues in the area. And with the intense growth that is going to come here because of Foxconn and other, housing developments and different things, we need to look at not only these two, which might be ripe for some kind of consolidations, cost savings, or better service for our local residents, but other things too. And we have talked about many things that you've addressed too, and I'm sure we're going to delve deeper into those subjects. But I think it's a great opportunity that we've all gotten together, get to know each other, and start to work on things in the area.
David DeGroot, Village of Mount Pleasant. I think tonight we've heard the why we're here, but I'd just like to take a minute to explain the how we got here. And it really started a couple years back, as Jim mentioned. I got a call from the Johnson Foundation, and they asked us to get together with our peers if we'd be so kind as to sit down around the table and have a conversation about the matters of the day. And I thought, sure, why not? What they really had in mind was to get us out of our respective municipal silos and sitting across from each other so that we could humanize our mutual concerns. The expectations of that first meeting weren't great. I've got to tell you that I remember joking at that first meeting, look, if we can agree that the sky is blue, that's going to be a win. Well, fortunately, we agreed that the sky was blue, and that gave us a commonality and a basis, frankly, for calling another meeting to get together again. It didn't take too much meeting for us to come to the conclusion that, look, we all suffer the same problems. And the basic question is always, how do you deliver the best taxpayer bang for the buck? How do we give our constituents the best government service at the most meaningful way and price? And it didn't take too long, for us to come to the conclusion that, look, we're going to have some data to, do this kind of analysis. So I want to thank Rob Henkin for doing what he does best, which is primary research, crunching numbers, and then taking that data and being able to report it out in a way that's meaningful and understanding to us. And I'd also like to thank the Johnson Foundation for doing what they do best, which is fostering conversation. At the end of the day here, I don't know where this study is going to go because we have to take it back to our own municipalities, and I know that the public is going to weigh in on it as well. But I'm not going to kid you. I mean, we're not curing cancer here tonight. We're not solving world peace. But I'd like to think that because we were able to get out of our silos, that we're creating a better peace among our greater community. And I think that that's the legacy of agreeing that the sky was blue and being able to play that forward. So again, thank you everybody for coming out, and those watching, hope that you're getting something out of this. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for being here tonight. Corey Mason, Mayor of the City of Racine. Again, just to echo the thanks that people have made already for the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread, for the work that Rob Henkin has done, for the work that Roger Dower and Ashley Stake and everyone at Wingspread has done. I also want to acknowledge the county executive for his leadership in all of this. I think he's been instrumental in getting us all to come together. I think at this, absolutely. I think for me, when I think about what we want to try to achieve here, I always come back to this idea that we have a shared future together as a region, that we will succeed as a region together, or avoid. We will either rise to the occasion to overcome some of the challenges we have, or we might miss the opportunities to overcome some of the challenges that are before us. These are not easy things, and I don't think anybody comes here today saying that we have the answers today. I think it's been said, and I'll reiterate it, this is the start of a conversation, and part of the reason we came to present this to the public today is I think we got to the point where all of us felt like we need to begin to have more public dialogue about what these options are, instead of presenting everybody with the outcomes and saying, here's what we decided, what do you think? And I appreciate the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread's flexibility with all of us to have this public dialogue. The other thing that I think we should acknowledge, though, that's pretty great here is you have the county board and 4 municipalities meeting jointly, certainly for the first time that I can remember, maybe the first time ever. I think that merits a round of applause and recognition. I think that's great that we're here together and asking tough questions. The questions before us as a community are hard. Coming up with the answers, coming up with the questions as to what makes a resilient community is not easy. But I do know that we are closer to figuring out those questions and maybe those answers because we spent the last 2 years meeting with one another and beginning to have dialogue and having those relationships. There's going to be a lot of room for conversation moving forward. Again, tough questions, tough answers. But I still have confidence that our ability to answer those questions are really going to require us to work together because we share the same future. And at the end of the day, whether it's wanting to know that the people who live in your community can succeed and enter into the class regardless of the background, or wanting to know that the constituents that you have can have a quick and adequate response time for emergency or personnel, or that no matter where you live, you've got access to parks. Those are all things that we care about, and those are all things that should help define us. So I'm optimistic about what the future holds, even though the challenges we have might be substantial. And I have more confidence that we'll be able to solve them by meeting and talking together than if we went it alone. Thanks, everyone.
My name is Jason Eckman, trustee for the Village of Sturtevant. I also would like to thank the Johnson Foundation at Wingspread for hosting the Resilient Communities Roundtable. I think it's hard to imagine that this group would be together otherwise. Also like to thank Rob and the Wisconsin Policy Forum for the independent and good work that you do. And finally, I'd like to thank President Hoffman for allowing me the opportunity to represent the Village of Sturtevant in this process. When I look at Racine County from east of the interstate, I see it's changing visibly on a daily basis. And those changes are going to create new challenges for us. And at the same time, people don't know when they cross the border from one municipality to another. And as our board is used to hearing me say, there is no more money, right? So in order to address these new challenges, as well as our existing challenges with increased healthcare and other costs, either we need to reduce services or we need to be more efficient. And based on the work of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, I see that there are opportunities here to both reduce capital spending and operational expense. And what I'd like to do is to encourage the respective boards to continue to evaluate these options for the success of the region. Thank you.
You can, whatever you want to do, yeah. Well, this is what I would say, and I'll end it kind of where I started. This is just the beginning. It's not the end. I know that the best days of Racine, Greater Racine, Mount Pleasant, Caledonia, Sturtevant, and our other municipalities are ahead of us. I know most of you in the room, everybody in this room, or most of you in this room that I know, the intent is to make our community better and greater in a lot of different ways. And together we're going to do that. These conversations are important. You may disagree with the first step or may disagree with the second step, but at the end of the day, we're taking steps, and that's critical moving forward. So the presentations and the report summary, they're going to be going to the individual boards, and they're also going to be online. So please take a look at that. As Rob mentioned, he didn't get into all the details, but the details are in those reports. So with that, there's hors d'oeuvres and cocktails upstairs, so please feel to partake, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you very much.